Bipolar disorder used to be one disorder. Nobody was diagnosed with it unless they experienced a severe episode of mania, like one that wrecked your life, put you in the hospital, or caused psychosis. But now there's a bipolar 1 and 2, so a lot of people think bipolar 2 must be the milder type. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about bipolar disorder. There are two different types of bipolar disorder, but one isn't considered the severe type and the other the mild type. They are just two different presentations of the disorder. I'm Patty, the girl with blue energy. I have ADHD and bipolar disorder. Today I'm talking about bipolar 2. Why we have a type 2 bipolar disorder, why so many people think it's the milder type, and why we don't just call it all bipolar spectrum disorder. Ever since bipolar 2 was added to the DSM, its existence as a psychiatric disorder has been debated. We've known about bipolar 2 since before bipolar disorder was even called bipolar disorder, but it took a while before it was officially added to the DSM. I'm going to explain why a second type of bipolar disorder was added, and also why some people disagreed with expanding the diagnosis. In the 1960s, psychiatrist David Dunner first proposed the idea of expanding the diagnosis into two types of bipolar disorder. While reviewing patient data from people who were hospitalized with a mood disorder, he identified three separate groups. One group had only depression, another group had depression and mania, and a third group had depression but also experienced a less severe form of mania called hypomania. What was interesting about the patients in the third group was that they all had a family history of bipolar disorder, but they weren't diagnosed with it themselves. Their mood disorder was severe enough to require hospitalization, but their mood episodes didn't meet the criteria for mania. This was what led Dunner to believe that this was a different presentation of bipolar disorder. Even though their hypomanic episodes weren't severe enough to meet the criteria for mania, they were bipolar in every other way. Bipolar 2 was officially added to the DSM in 1994. It is considered a distinctly separate type of bipolar disorder. Although it is very similar to bipolar 1, there are a few key differences. If you look up the symptoms for bipolar 1 and 2, you will see that their symptoms look almost identical. But with bipolar 2, you don't experience full manic episodes. Instead, you experience episodes of hypomania. This is where the idea that bipolar 2 is milder comes from. So hypo means less than or lower than. So hypomania means a milder or shorter lasting form of mania. Since most people don't really understand the difference between hypomania and mania, I'm going to briefly explain the difference. Both hypomania and mania involve having an elevated or irritable mood that lasts for a distinct period of time. For it to be considered hypomania, it must last at least 4 days, and mania must last at least 7 days unless you need to be hospitalized or experience psychosis. Mania is more severe and lasts longer than hypomania. So it's not just that it's 7 days or longer. It's also more severe. When you have hypomania, there will be a noticeable change in functioning, but it won't be so severe that it impairs your social or occupational functioning. In other words, you can usually go to work and take care of your responsibilities when you're hypomanic. It doesn't severely impair your functioning the way mania does. A lot of people actually notice that they're more productive when they're hypomanic. This is when they go on cleaning sprees and get a lot of projects done. So it's not always flagged as hypomania. Not having full manic episodes isn't the only difference, though. When you have bipolar 1, the only requirement for a diagnosis is that you've experienced one episode of mania. So most people with bipolar 1 also experience episodes of depression, but it's not required for diagnosis. When you have bipolar 2, you must experience at least one episode of hypomania and 1 episode of major depression. People with bipolar 2 tend to have more frequent and longer episodes of depression than people diagnosed with bipolar 1. But it's not as simple as bipolar 1 has full mania and bipolar 2 has more depression. They are both variations of the same disorder. So why don't we just call it all bipolar spectrum disorder instead of the 2 separate types? There has actually been a lot of debate over the years about how bipolar 2 is categorized. Some argue that it should be diagnosed as one spectrum disorder rather than type 1 and type 2. And some psychiatrists already refer to bipolar disorder as a spectrum disorder. But as of right now, it is categorized in the DSM as bipolar 1 and 2. And based on my research, I don't see that changing in the foreseeable future. But it's still worth talking about because some experts think the criteria used to divide bipolar 1 from bipolar 2 is arbitrary. Why 4 days for hypomania and 7 for mania? And how do we determine the severity? And if someone has severe symptoms that last only a few days, is this hypomania or mania? Does this mean they have bipolar 1 or bipolar 2? I've talked about the debate around what's hypomania and what's mania before. If you want to understand this better, check out my video on hypomania versus mania. People can experience longer episodes of hypomania or shorter episodes of mania. So why not just call it all bipolar spectrum disorder and then document the length and severity of the manic episodes? Some doctors think this makes more sense, and others think it's better to have a type 1 and type 2. The debate about bipolar 2 isn't so much about whether or not it exists. It's more about how it should be categorized. Should it be its own diagnosis, or should it be part of a broader, more unified bipolar spectrum disorder diagnosis? Surprisingly, some doctors don't believe in bipolar 2. When I first read this, I was astonished. I believe this is a small minority, but there are still some who think bipolar 2 shouldn't be a diagnosis. And much of this goes back to the diagnostic criteria being too arbitrary. Some think that by defining hypomania as 4 days, the boundary between hypomania and normal mood changes can be hard to distinguish. And since many experience a boost in productivity when they're hypomanic and not an actual impairment in functioning, are these symptoms really symptoms of a disorder? Some doctors also think the symptoms of bipolar 2 overlap with other conditions like borderline personality disorder and major depression, making it hard to diagnose it as its own disorder. This can be true, and bipolar 2 is often misdiagnosed, but that doesn't mean it's not its own disorder. I have even read actual research that suggested that by expanding the bipolar diagnosis into type 1 and 2, that this gave the pharmaceutical manufacturers more opportunities to market medication and diagnose people with bipolar disorder. Now that you know a little bit more about bipolar 2 and its history, let's talk about some of the misconceptions people have. Why do people insist that bipolar 2 is the milder type of bipolar disorder? The biggest reason people think bipolar 2 is milder is because bipolar 2 doesn't experience full manic episodes. But this isn't the only reason. Some of this is psychology. Our brains tend to think number 1 is the most severe and number 2 is milder. We think of things in order. So type 1 diabetes is more severe than type 2. So many people think bipolar 2 is less severe simply because it's the second type. But this idea gets reinforced because there's a lack of education on bipolar 2. People have a rough idea about what bipolar disorder is, but bipolar 2 isn't talked about as much or researched as much, so people just don't know as much about it. Another big reason why people think bipolar 2 is milder is because hypomania isn't looked at the same way as mania. Mania is seen as destructive, out of control, reckless behavior. hypomania can be seen as a good thing. One of the things you hear about a lot is how productive people are when they're hypomanic. When you have bipolar 2, people don't worry about you the same way when you're hypomanic. They can see it as a bonus or a positive thing. They don't always see it as part of the disorder. People also don't understand how severe bipolar depression can be, whether you have type 1 or type 2. Depression is often the hardest symptom to live with. And when you have bipolar 2, you typically have more frequent and longer episodes of depression. Here's what people don't understand about bipolar disorder. Severity isn't based on what number comes after your diagnosis. Both can be severe and both can be manageable. What makes bipolar 1 or 2 more severe is your own personal symptoms. One of the reasons why bipolar 2 can be so severe is because of how frequent and long the depression episodes can be. A really long episode of depression can take a toll on you. With bipolar 2, the hypomanic episodes don't last as long, so they may feel like a relief. But then when the depression returns, it's crushing. People with bipolar 2 tend to have more issues with suicidal feelings and suicide attempts than people with bipolar 1. And this may be because of how long and exhausting the depression episodes can be. When it comes to the severity of an illness, the impact it has on your life needs to be considered, not just the number after your diagnosis or the type of mania you experience. Let me give you a few examples to help you understand. Someone with bipolar 1 might have manic episodes that are severe, but they don't happen very often and they don't last very long. So it might look more severe based on the diagnosis, but when you consider the impairment and the actual impact it has on the person's life, it may not be as severe as someone who has bipolar 2. A person with bipolar 2 may have less intense episodes of hypomania, but these episodes may impact their life more severely. Maybe they have a challenging job, like they're a nurse or a teacher, so a little hypomania may have a bigger impact on their job and their life. Or maybe they have frequent episodes of depression that requires hospitalization. This might severely impact their life. You can have severe symptoms with both types of bipolar disorder, even if you don't experience full manic episodes. One of the hardest parts about being diagnosed with bipolar 2 is that it's not talked about as much, it's not researched as much, and it's not as well understood. In many ways, bipolar 2 can feel like the invisible bipolar disorder. People with it don't always feel seen or heard because they're told that their disorder is less than bipolar 1 or their symptoms are not as severe. And one of the things that makes me sad is that bipolar disorder is tough to live with, regardless of which type you have. Being diagnosed with bipolar disorder means you have to deal with stigma and judgment. When you have bipolar 2, you may have to live with a different kind of stigma than you already have to deal with. People will tell you that it's easier to live with, that it's milder, or at least you don't have bipolar 1. This is why it's important that we talk about bipolar 2 and not just lump it in with bipolar 1. I don't like comparing the two types of bipolar disorder as if one is worse than the other. Bipolar 1 or 2 can affect each person differently, but bipolar 2 is not mild or easy to live with. I hope you found this video helpful. I try to make educational mental health videos. If you like this video, please support my channel by clicking the like button and, of course, subscribe. I'll have another video out for you guys real soon.